Chapter 1. The Mysterious Death. The air was crisp that autumn afternoon, a fine mist clinging to the air like the last breath of summer. The trees surrounding Lord and Lady Ramsgate's grand estate stood tall and proud, their leaves now painted in hues of amber, gold, and crimson. A light breeze rustled through the branches, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. In this peaceful corner of Hampshire, the evening seemed destined to be as serene as any other, until the event that would shatter this calm. I had only just arrived at the estate, invited by my old friend, Captain Hastings, who had been an intimate guest of the Ramsgate household for the past few days. The dinner party that evening had been nothing out of the ordinary, a gathering of the upper crust of English society, whose conversations danced around matters of art, politics, and the usual concerns of those who had too much time on their hands. The meal was served in the grand dining hall, a long mahogany table laid with fine china and silver, the flickering candlelight casting a soft glow over the faces of the gathered company. There was Lord Ramsgate, a man in his late 50s, whose greying hair suggested a life lived to the full, though his hard, calculating eyes spoke of secrets buried beneath that genial exterior. His wife, Lady Ramsgate, sat at his side, pale and composed, her elegant mannerisms betraying no hint of the deep unhappiness I suspected lay behind her cool facade. The other guests were a mixture of old acquaintances and distant relatives. There was Miss Lydia Wren, a young woman with a sharp tongue and a penchant for sarcasm, whose looks were still striking despite the years creeping up on her. Her cousin, Reginald Calloway, a man of middling age with an air of perpetual discontent, whose fortune seemed as ill-gotten as his manners. Then there was the ever-silent and enigmatic butler, Mr. Farrington, tall, with a face so impeccably impassive that it gave nothing away. His movements were graceful, precise, too precise if one were to be suspicious. The evening had unfolded as such gatherings often do. There was laughter, the clinking of glasses, the hum of idle conversation. But as the hours wore on, I sensed a growing unease in the air, an odd tension between the guests. I could not quite place it, but something about Lord Ramsgate's manner, his terse responses to certain questions, the quiet glances exchanged between him and his wife, struck me as out of place. And then, of course, there was the tea. A strange thing happened as the meal wound down. Lord Ramsgate had excused himself, citing the need to retire to his study for some private matters. His wife had remained behind with the guests, as had Mr. Farrington, the butler, who dutifully cleared the table and went about his business with quiet efficiency. But just as I was beginning to feel the evening draw to its close, a shrill cry pierced the calm. Lady Ramsgate, her voice trembling, had found her husband. I quickly excused myself, following the others into the library where the scene awaited us. There he was, Lord Ramsgate, slumped over his desk, an untouched cup of tea beside him, and a look of mild surprise frozen on his face. It was a sight I had seen many times before, the unexpected death, the one that sends a ripple of shock through the company, but none of the immediate signs of foul play. The initial assumption, at least by the guests, was that he had suffered a sudden and fatal heart attack. But I, Hercule Poirot, had learned long ago to never trust first appearances. As the body was attended to by the servants, I took my place, quietly in the room, observing. I could not shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The tea, for instance. It was placed at an odd angle on the desk, half sipped, but the way the cup rested there, it seemed almost deliberate, an odd positioning for such an everyday item. Had Lord Ramsgate simply forgotten it in his haste to work? Or was something else at play? And then there was the butler, Farrington, standing just at the doorway, his expression a study in cold indifference, his hands carefully folded in front of him. "Has anyone touched the cup?" I asked, my voice breaking the silence. The question seemed to unnerve the others. Lady Ramsgate looked startled, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as though trying to gather the strength to speak. "No, Monsieur Poirot," she said faintly. "No one has touched it." And yet I could see the slight tremor in her fingers, the way her eyes avoided the teacup. There was something else at work here, something more than just a natural death. I turned to Farrington, who had now stepped forward, his ever-calm demeanour, betraying nothing. "Mr. Farrington," I began, "tell me, how long ago did you serve the tea to Lord Ramsgate?" The butler paused for a moment, his gaze flicking toward the body before returning to me. It was just before he retired to his study. "Monsieur, about half an hour ago, I should say." I nodded slowly, noting the faint hint of hesitation in his voice. "And was there anything unusual about the tea, Mr. Farrington?" "Unusual, sir?" His brow furrowed slightly, but only the slightest hint of tension betrayed the perfect composure he so carefully cultivated. "No, nothing at all. It was as it should be." But his eyes... Yes, his eyes gave him away. A slight, almost imperceptible flicker of discomfort, as though something far more dangerous lurked beneath his placid surface. I turned to the other guests, scanning their faces, each one blank with shock, but all of them too willing to accept the death as a simple, tragic accident. But I knew better. As surely as I knew the sun would rise tomorrow, I knew that Lord Ramsgate's death was not the result of a natural cause. Someone had murdered him, and the clue to his death, I was certain, lay in that cup of tea. "Madame, Monsieur," I said, softly, my eyes narrowing as I turned back to the scene. "I am sorry to disturb your grief, but it seems I must take it upon myself to investigate. This, I assure you, is not an ordinary death." At that moment I knew my involvement was inevitable. Something about this place, this gathering, was off. There was a puzzle to be solved, and, as always, I, Hercule Poirot, would be the one to solve it. The room fell silent as my words settled in. Only the steady ticking of the grandfather clock and the soft rustling of the wind outside filled the oppressive quiet. I could already feel the tendrils of suspicion wrapping around me, and I knew I had to dig deeper. "Everything will become clear, but only with patience and the exercise of my little grey cells," I murmured, more to myself than to anyone else. And so, with that, the investigation began. But who among them was lying? Who had the motive? And who had placed that cup of tea beside the corpse? That I would soon find out. The first chapter closes and the puzzle grows more intricate. The guests, seemingly so ordinary, now hold the key to unravelling the death of Lord Ramsgate. Chapter 2. The butler's tea took my time as I studied the scene again, carefully allowing my little grey cells to work in their methodical manner. The body of Lord Ramsgate was still where it had fallen, his head slumped against the polished wood of his desk, a slight sheen of perspiration on his forehead that suggested the death had been sudden. The cup of tea beside him, however, was a more perplexing mystery than the body itself. The positioning of the cup stood out immediately. It sat slightly askew, as though it had been placed hurriedly or with intent. Yet there was no spill, no sign of any agitation. The tea within was cold, at least an hour old I would estimate, but there were no signs of disturbance. A strange thing, I thought. If one were to leave their tea to cool, would it not have been moved in some fashion? Not a single mark was upon the desk either, not a dribble or stain. No, this had been placed with precision. I moved closer, not touching the cup, but carefully observing its every detail. The delicate handle, the thin china, the fine embroidery on the rim. Such a cup would be used by only the most fastidious of individuals. And yet here it was, so carefully positioned next to the corpse of the man who had wielded it. Why? What purpose did this act serve? Turning to Farrington, the butler who had served the tea, I studied his face. His expression, though unchanged, was more telling than any words. I noticed his hands, clasped behind his back, never moving, never betraying an ounce of anxiety. He had been standing near the door, watching the scene unfold, his impassive demeanour only serving to raise the hair on the back of my neck. I could not tell if his poise was a deliberate act, or merely the result of a calm temperament. "Mr. Farrington," I said, my voice deliberately slow and measured, "you served Lord Ramsgate the tea just before he retired to his study?" "Yes, sir," he replied, with no hesitation, his tone formal as ever. "It was the usual tea, as always." "I see. And was it prepared in the usual way?" I pressed. "Exactly the same as every other time?" He glanced at me briefly, a flicker of something I could not place in his eyes before he responded, "Of course, Monsieur Poirot, as always." I nodded, considering this. The tea, it was not too strong, nor too weak, and the milk, added in just the right quantity. Farrington's lips twitched slightly, a hint of defensiveness in his expression. "As you say, Monsieur Poirot, just the right amount, as always." I did not push him further at that moment, for I could see that his answers were as much a product of his meticulous nature as they were of his careful, if not slightly evasive, personality. There was something odd about his insistence that nothing had changed in the preparation. But I kept my thoughts to myself, for I needed to look at the other details of the room. My eyes fell again on the desk, this time at a corner of a piece of paper caught beneath the edge of the desk. I moved towards it, slowly, my mind already turning over what this might mean. I picked up the fragment, its edges torn, as though someone had hastily torn it from a larger sheet. The paper was old, yellowed with time, and written in an elegant, flowing hand. Though only a small portion of the note remained, it was enough to suggest that something had been written in haste. But what? I brought it closer, squinting slightly, as my fingers gingerly turned the fragment to get a better look. It was a letter, a short one, from what seemed to be a business associate. The handwriting was unmistakable, Lord Ramsgate's own, but what had been written on the rest of the sheet? What had been torn away? I slipped the fragment into my pocket, the puzzle pieces beginning to align in my mind, but still incomplete. There were too many questions, too many doubts, and the answers, I knew, would not come easily. As I continued to examine the room, my thoughts kept returning to the tea. It had been served, yet Farrington's routine, as he had claimed, seemed a little too perfect, almost mechanical. The butler's calm demeanour was too well practised, and I began to wonder whether he had prepared the tea with some deeper knowledge in mind. What if the tea had been altered? What if the cup had not been positioned by accident, but deliberately? I turned back to Farrington. "Mr. Farrington, tell me," I asked, my voice still soft but purposeful. "Do you recall anyone else in the house this afternoon? Someone who might have had access to the tea before you served it?" The butler's gaze shifted ever so slightly. "No, monsieur, I was alone in the kitchen. I prepared the tea as usual and delivered it as I always do." "Ah, yes," I said, nodding slowly. You are always alone when serving tea? Yes, Monsieur Poirot, he replied stiffly, a touch of irritation now creeping into his voice. I assure you, there was nothing unusual about the tea, nor my actions. I did not tamper with it. Of course not, I murmured, half to myself. But tell me, Mr. Farrington, if I may ask, did you notice anything unusual about Lord Ramsgate's behaviour before he retired to his study? For a moment Farrington stood still, his eyes narrowing slightly as though considering the question. Nothing, Monsieur Poirot. He was in good spirits, if that is what you mean. Nothing that would give cause for concern. I considered his answer, but the tone in which he had spoken unsettled me. A moment's hesitation, a fleeting glance, and then his mask of calm returned. Was it mere politeness, or was it something else? I dismissed him for the moment, allowing my thoughts to wander as I surveyed the rest of the room. The book-lined walls, the rich dark wood, the slight scent of tobacco and dust in the air. Nothing out of the ordinary. But I knew deep within my bones that something was amiss. There was no such thing as a completely natural death. I had solved too many cases to believe that. I turned to Lady Ramsgate, who had been standing at the threshold of the library, quietly observing. She had said nothing since her initial cry of discovery. Her face was pale, her hands tightly clasped together, and I could see the edges of her carefully composed exterior beginning to crack. Her eyes flicked nervously between me and the body of her husband, as though the very sight of it was too much to bear. Mademoiselle Ramsgate, I began gently, please tell me, what was Lord Ramsgate's mood like during dinner? Her lips parted slightly as she considered my question. Then, almost as if answering to some unspoken cue, she said, he was distant, more so than usual. Distant? In what way? I asked, leaning forward slightly. She glanced around as though unsure whether to speak freely. Finally, she lowered her voice. He seemed preoccupied. He barely spoke, even when the others tried to engage him. I thought perhaps it was the weight of his responsibilities weighing on him. He has always been a man of business, you know, but that night he was different. I noticed him looking out the window several times during dinner, as if lost in thought. She paused, glancing at the body again, her voice faltering. I never thought it would end like this. Thank you, madame, I said, noting the significance of her words. There was more here than mere distraction, I suspected. Perhaps her husband had been troubled by something, an issue from which his thoughts were never far. As the servants began to clear the room, preparing for the inevitable questioning of each individual, I remained at the scene. I had not yet finished. There were pieces still missing. The torn letter fragment, the oddly placed teacup, Farrington's defensiveness, it was all too much to be coincidence. And I was certain that the answers, however elusive, were hidden in the tiniest of details. Chapter 3. A Deadly Game. The evening had cast a deep shadow over the estate as I moved away from the scene of Lord Ramsgate's death. The household was abuzz with the quiet stirrings of servants preparing for a long night of questions, and yet the air remained thick with unspoken thoughts. I was particularly aware of Lady Ramsgate's unease as she stood near the window, her gaze cast down to the manicured grounds below, her posture stiff. I did not disturb her. Instead, I turned to the guests who had already gathered in the drawing-room. The dinner party had been intimate enough, 8 people in all, including Lord and Lady Ramsgate, as well as their close circle of friends and business associates. But already something in the atmosphere seemed out of place. The polite, restrained manners of these individuals had begun to fray at the edges, revealing the delicate tensions lurking beneath. There had been whispers before dinner, subtle exchanges, but nothing overt, yet. I had decided to start my inquiries with the individuals closest to the family, beginning with those who had known Lord Ramsgate the longest. As I entered the drawing room, I noted that each of the guests had already seated themselves, the women fidgeting with handkerchiefs or clutching a drink, while the men avoided eye contact. They had no choice but to wait for me, their suspicions growing with each passing minute. I turned my attention to Mr. Edward Darley, a man in his late 30s, thin and angular, with the sharp eyes of someone accustomed to observing and calculating. His appearance, neatly pressed suit, and an air of quiet authority made him seem the very picture of a man who had everything under control. And yet there was something about his fingers, twisting restlessly around his glass, that suggested a different story. "Mr. Darley," I began, my tone gentle but firm, "you and Lord Ramsgate were business associates, were you not?" He nodded, a faint smile on his lips, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Indeed, we had dealings for many years." "Ah," I said thoughtfully, "and I understand you were engaged in a discussion earlier this evening about matters of family wealth." At my words, his expression flickered for an instant. I watched it closely, but he quickly regained his composure. "That is true," he said, his voice calm but strained. "Lord Ramsgate was, well, he was concerned, as anyone would be, about certain financial matters." He hesitated, glancing sideways as though gauging his words. But there was no argument. "Poirot, no shouting, nothing of the sort. We had a civil conversation." "Ah," I said, my gaze narrowing. "A civil conversation, yes. But Lady Ramsgate overheard your exchange, and I believe she would not agree with that description." I noted his stiffened posture and the slight reddening of his cheeks. "She said the conversation was heated." A flicker of something unease, perhaps, passed through Darley's eyes. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "I won't deny that tensions were high, but Ramsgate was being irrational, speaking about the inheritance as though it was a matter of life and death. The man was obsessed with it, you know." He paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, "But I didn't wish him harm, Poirot. I had no reason to." I studied his face for a moment longer. His words rang true on the surface, but something about the way he spoke, almost too defensively, struck me as odd. "You were certainly familiar with his financial troubles?" I asked, leaning forward. "The inheritance, the investments. Perhaps it was not as much a civil conversation as you now make it out to be." He tensed, but before he could respond, I turned away, signaling that our conversation had concluded. I would revisit him later once I had gathered more facts. Next, I turned my attention to Lady Eleanor Grey, a woman with delicate features framed by dark, curling hair. She had a beauty that was at once captivating and cold, like marble, the sort of woman who appeared calm, but who could easily conceal a sharp edge. She was seated at the far end of the room, her face pale, and her eyes rimmed with dark circles. I could see she had not slept, and I had little doubt that she had been deeply affected by the events of the evening. "Lady Grey," I began, offering her a small smile, "I trust you are well after the events of this evening?" She nodded stiffly, her lips trembling ever so slightly. I don't know how I can be well after such a terrible tragedy." "Lord Ramsgate." Her voice broke for a moment, and she quickly composed herself, smoothing the folds of her evening gown. We had only just spoken at dinner, and everything seemed so normal. Normal, you say? I pressed. And yet I understand you. We're not far from the library, just moments before the discovery of his body. Her eyes widened, and she seemed to shrink back, her fingers twisting her napkin in her lap. I was, yes. I left just after dinner and I had to pass the library on my way to the hallway. But when I passed, I didn't think to look in. I didn't think anything was amiss. I murmured. But you overheard something, did you not? A conversation, an argument between your husband and Mr. Darley, yes? Her expression shifted again, this time to one of discomfort. It was not an argument, I assure you. It was just heated. They were speaking about inheritance, about what should happen to the family estate. It was nothing out of the ordinary. It was just business. She added the last words almost as though trying to convince herself. But what if that was the cause of Lord Ramsgate's distress? It is quite possible, I replied, watching her closely. And yet I find it odd that after overhearing such a conversation, you would not have mentioned it earlier. If it weighed so heavily on your mind, surely you would have confessed it to the police or even to me sooner. She bit her lip, her eyes darting to the others in the room. I didn't want to make matters worse, Poirot. I didn't want to cause any unnecessary problems. After all, Lord Ramsgate was my husband. I nodded slowly, not entirely convinced. There was something in the way she hesitated, the way she skirted around the issue, but I would allow her time. People, particularly those close to the victim, often took longer to come to terms with the truth. As I continued my interviews with the remaining guests, I found that the accounts became more and more contradictory. Mr. Julian Firth, a man with the air of someone who had never worked a day in his life, claimed not to have heard anything amiss during dinner, yet he seemed oddly nervous when pressed about his movements after dinner. His stories about his time in the garden were vague, and he seemed more interested in casting suspicion on others than providing concrete answers. Mrs. Sylvia Graves, a widow with a sharp tongue and a sharper mind, was the most forthcoming of all, though her story was contradictory in its own way. She spoke freely about Ramsgate's recent business dealings, painting a portrait of a man driven to desperation. He was under enormous pressure, she said, shaking her head. I saw it on his face every day. Money worries, inheritance battles, it was all consuming him. But her words, too, rang hollow. Her insistence that everyone knew about Ramsgate's troubles seemed too rehearsed, almost like a cover-up, and it left me wondering, what else was she hiding? By the time I had finished with the interviews, the threads of the case were beginning to weave themselves together. It was clear that Lord Ramsgate's death was no mere accident or natural passing. Something or someone had hastened his end, and though the guests were quick to speak, I sensed deeper currents at work, currents of greed, jealousy, and ambition. I returned to the study, my mind heavy with these revelations. The tea, the argument, the inheritance. These were no mere coincidences. There was a truth hidden somewhere in this web of lies and deceit. I turned to the others. The truth is a cruel thing, mon ami, I murmured to myself. But we will find it, piece by piece. Chapter 4. The Inheritance and Secret. The estate had grown quieter as the night stretched on, the dinner party's merry chatter replaced by hushed voices and furtive glances. Lady Ramsgate, still visibly shaken, had retired to her chambers, while the guests, those who had not already been interviewed, milled about in tense silence. As the time passed, a growing weight hung over the house, as though something intangible lingered in the air, daring anyone to speak of it aloud. Returned to the drawing-room, where the faint glow of the fireplace cast a soft light over the scene. The guests who remained were still, their minds no doubt swirling with questions, but I, Hercule Poirot, had only one focus: the truth. And it was becoming clearer with each passing moment that I had only scratched the surface. "What of the will?" I asked the assembled group, my gaze settling on Mr. Darley, who had spoken the most during the evening's discussions. "I understand Lord Ramsgate had recently made revisions to it." The mention of the will made the room tense. There was a slight shift in the posture of several guests, though none of them spoke immediately. It was as though the words alone had cast an invisible shadow over them. "Ah, yes," Darley said, a little too quickly. "It was a new version of the will, just some minor changes, nothing extraordinary." "Minor?" I repeated, raising an eyebrow. "And what precisely was altered in these minor changes?" There was another uncomfortable pause, followed by a long, drawn-out sigh from Lady Sylvia Graves, who was seated closest to the fire. "Lord Ramsgate had become, well, more anxious in recent months," she said, her voice slightly strained, though she kept her composure. "He had become concerned about the future of his estate, of the family's wealth. There were some who believed he might change his mind about who was to inherit." A flicker of interest passed through me, and I took a step closer. "Who exactly would stand to benefit from these changes?" "Well, it is no secret," Darley interjected, "that Lord Ramsgate had disagreements with his family, especially his son. There were whispers of old wounds, debts, broken promises, that sort of thing. A wisp of a smile danced at the corner of my lips. I had learned enough by now to know when I was being fed half-truths. "And these changes, who stood to benefit most?" Darley cleared his throat, his eyes shifting. "It's not so simple, Poirot. Lord Ramsgate was a complicated man. His will was written in such a way that no one person could claim everything. His son was his heir, but there were conditions, very specific conditions attached to his inheritance. And then there was his daughter. She, too, had some claim." I felt the tug of suspicion in my mind. "His son and daughter," I said thoughtfully. "But how could they both stand to gain? Surely there was no confusion between them. What of the rest of the family?" "Ramsgate's temper was notorious," Sylvia Graves said, her voice dipping lower as though speaking of something far more dangerous. "He didn't always get on well with the rest of the family. And his son, well, I've heard he was deeply involved in some of Lord Ramsgate's less legal dealings. It's said that he had been causing trouble for years, running up debts." "His daughter?" I pressed. "Lady Clarissa?" Sylvia laughed lightly, though it was laced with bitterness. "She had her share of disagreements with him too, but she had more tact, more decorum, and she wasn't as reckless as her brother." I nodded. This did not add up to a clear inheritance plan. The stakes were high, the emotions volatile, and yet the truth was nowhere near as simple as it seemed. I had to learn more. My mind wandered back to the butler, Mr. Farrington. There was something about his strange behaviour earlier that had not yet been explained. He had been far too evasive, and his nervousness seemed out of place. I had not fully explored his involvement in this matter, and something told me that he might hold the key to unlocking the final pieces of the puzzle. I made a quick decision. "Mon ami," I said softly to the room, "I believe it is time we spoke with the servants, particularly Mr. Farrington. If the family's future was as uncertain as it seems, then the servants, who have been in this house longer than anyone, may have observed something crucial." The room fell silent. It was as though my words had lifted a veil of uncertainty over everyone in the room. No one seemed eager to speak, but all were looking for something, anything that might explain the strange happenings. I turned away and moved to the hallway, where I found Mr. Farrington standing stiffly near the staff quarters. His face was pale, and his hands were clenched tightly behind his back. He looked like a man preparing to face something he couldn't escape. "Mr. Farrington," I began, my voice sharp yet calm. "May I speak with you in private?" He swallowed, his eyes darting nervously from side to side. "Of course, sir. Anything, sir?" We stepped into the empty staff room, the door creaking shut behind us. I studied the butler for a moment, allowing the silence to settle between us like a thick fog. His discomfort was palpable. "Mr. Farrington," I began, folding my hands behind my back. "You have served Lord Ramsgate for many years, yes? You know the household well. Tell me, do you recall anything unusual happening? Before or after the dinner?" He shifted, taking a breath. "No, sir. Nothing unusual. As I said, but you did serve Lord Ramsgate his tea," I interrupted. "It was you who brought it to him, was it not?" He stiffened again, but nodded quickly. Yes. "Sir, I did. I placed it on the desk just as usual. It was his favourite blend, sir, the Earl Grey with a touch of lemon." "And yet," I continued, "the cup was found beside him, but not in a natural position. It was as though it had been moved." Farrington's expression tightened, and I saw a glimmer of something in his eyes. "Guilt? Fear? Sir, he began, but his words were cut off by a sudden noise from the adjoining room, a soft, scraping sound as if something had been moved. "Mr. Farrington," I said, my voice taking on a sharper edge, "I must ask you to accompany me. There is something you have not told me, something you are hiding. I must see your quarters." "Immediately." Farrington hesitated, his gaze darting toward the door, but he nodded. "Of course, sir." We moved quickly down the hallway, past the kitchen and the servants' quarters, and into the small room where Farrington lived. It was neat and orderly, though there was a strange heaviness in the air, a sense of something concealed. I motioned to him to step aside and began to examine the room with a practiced eye. Bookshelves lined the walls, and a small desk sat by the window. Nothing seemed out of place, but then my gaze fell upon his uniform, hanging neatly beside the door. "Do you mind if I look through your things?" I asked casually, as though it were the most natural question in the world. He shifted uncomfortably, but did not protest. I carefully reached into the pocket of his jacket and felt something small, tucked inside. It was a scrap of paper, crumpled and folded. I unfolded it, my eyes scanning the words written in a hurried, almost frantic hand. "Meet me tonight, after midnight. The will must be changed. It is the only way out." I turned to Farrington, whose face had drained of colour. Well, I said, my voice low but filled with the weight of my discovery. "It seems your involvement goes much deeper than I had originally suspected." Chapter 5. The Psychology of Lies. The next day unfolded as grey and oppressive as the day before, the shadows stretching long across the countryside. I found myself alone in the drawing-room, contemplating the letter I had found in Mr. Farrington's possession, the cryptic words still echoing in my mind. "Meet me tonight, after midnight. The will must be changed. It is the only way out." The implications of those words weighed heavily on me. It was clear that Farrington was not merely a passive observer in this matter. He had a role in the tragedy, and I suspected that role was far darker than he wished to admit. As I sat pondering, the soft tap of footsteps interrupted my thoughts. Hastings entered, his usual cheerful demeanour dampened by the weight of the case that had now claimed the attention of the entire estate. "Ah, Hastings," I said, my eyes never leaving the letter in my hand. "It seems that the puzzle is growing ever more intricate." pieces scattered, but none fitting quite right. The more I learn, the more elusive the answer becomes. Hastings perched himself on the edge of a chair. "I don't see how you can be so calm, Poirot. We have a dead man, a possibly forged will, a mysterious butler, and all manner of conflicting stories. I don't understand how you keep your composure." "Composure is the key, mon ami," I replied, "for while others flounder in their emotions and distractions, I keep my mind clear. The puzzle pieces, scattered as they are, will reveal a pattern eventually. It is only a matter of time." I leaned back in my chair, looking over the letter again. "Mr. Farrington's handwriting," I murmured, as though speaking to myself. "It is too similar, too precise. The same hand that wrote this note was the same hand that wrote to Lord Ramsgate. There is no doubt in my mind." Hastings frowned, clearly unsure of where I was going. "So, you think Farrington wrote to Ramsgate as well?" "Yes," I said. "And I believe that letter was more than just a request for a change of will. It was a demand, a coercion, perhaps. And now it seems Farrington has been caught in the web of his own deceit." I stood up suddenly, moving toward the window where the rolling hills outside stretched endlessly beneath the cloudy sky. "But Farrington is not the only one who hides something. Every person in that house has a secret, and it is time to uncover them. We must question the guests, each one individually, and probe their minds. The truth will reveal itself, Hastings, slowly but surely." The tension in the house had only grown since Lord Ramsgate's death, the atmosphere thick with suspicion. I was aware that every moment of hesitation could allow the culprit to slip away, but I also knew that rushing to conclusions would do me no good. The key to solving the puzzle lay in understanding the psychology of each individual. I began with the obvious choice, Lady Ramsgate, the widow. She had retired to her chambers after her brief interview with the police, but I knew she could offer valuable insights. With a soft knock on her door, I entered. Lady Ramsgate sat in a plush chair by the window, her face pale, her posture stiff. She looked at me with eyes that seemed both wary and exhausted. "Ah, Poirot," she said softly, her voice strained but polite. "I trust you have come to ask more questions?" "I am afraid so, madame," I replied, closing the door behind me. "But I am not here to pry into your grief. I wish to understand your relationship with your late husband, Lord Ramsgate." She stiffened at the mention of her late husband's name, but she maintained a calm composure. "My relationship with Charles," she began, choosing her words carefully, "was not without its difficulties. We had our disagreements, but nothing that would lead to this. He was a proud man, but I never imagined he would come to harm." I studied her carefully. Her words seemed genuine, but there was a slight hesitation, a flicker of something unspoken that lingered in her voice. "Did you know of the alterations to your husband's will?" I asked, watching her closely. Her eyes widened, just a fraction, and I noted the small change in her expression. "I had no idea. Charles kept those things to himself, but I can't say I'm surprised. He was always concerned about his legacy. He spoke often of it, though I never took much notice." "And what of the arguments tonight? Were you aware of any tensions between your husband and the guests?" She shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Yes," she said, her voice faltering slightly. "I overheard them. The arguments about money, inheritance. Charles was always so concerned about that. I think it weighed heavily on him in his later years." "And the butler, Mr. Farrington?" I asked. "How would you describe your relationship with him?" Her expression flickered for just a moment, an odd, almost imperceptible look of unease, Before she answered, Farrington was devoted to Charles. He was more than just a servant. He had been with the family for many years. But of course, he could be too attentive at times, almost to the point of being intrusive. I paused, reflecting on her words. Intrusive, I repeated softly. Interesting choice of words, madame. I meant no offence, she said quickly, her voice rising slightly. I simply mean that he seemed overly concerned with Lord Ramsgate's well-being. He was always hovering, always watching, a bit too much, if you ask me. I took in her words carefully, and, though they seemed harmless enough, a small seed of suspicion was planted in my mind. Lady Ramsgate had, without knowing it, just confirmed one of my earlier suspicions. Farrington was not merely a passive observer in this house. He had been deeply involved in his master's affairs, perhaps more than was healthy. As I turned to leave, I paused at the door. Lady Ramsgate, I must ask one last question. Have you ever noticed anything unusual in your husband's behavior? Something that might explain why he would make such a drastic revision to his will? Her gaze flickered for a moment, and I saw her lips tighten. No, nothing unusual, she said, her voice almost a whisper. But I did not believe her. There was something she was withholding, a detail that she refused to reveal. And that detail, I was certain, would unlock the final piece of the puzzle. I left her room, my thoughts swirling. There was much to consider, but one thing was becoming ever more apparent. The truth lay buried in the lies, in the carefully constructed facades of the people around me. It was a matter of sifting through them piece by piece until the final revelation came into focus. Hastings met me at the foot of the stairs, his brow furrowed with concern. Well, Poirot, what did you find out? The psychology of lies, Hastings, I said, my voice low, filled with quiet determination. It is the key to understanding these people. Everyone here has a motive, but not all of them are what they seem. The puzzle pieces are scattered, but we shall find the pattern. Patience, mon ami, patience. And as I said those words, I could feel the faint stirrings of the final revelation forming in my mind. The mystery was not far from unraveling, but there was one last interview to be had. One final piece of the puzzle was waiting to be uncovered. Chapter 6. The Missing Letter. The morning had barely begun when I found myself in the study once again, the carefully folded letter from Farrington still in my hand. My mind, honed as it was on the smallest of details, turned over its contents as if it were a clue itself, as if the paper could reveal something more. The words, blunt and purposeful, danced before me with increasing clarity. Meet me tonight after midnight. The will must be changed. It is the only way out. But it wasn't just the letter alone that troubled me. There were too many loose ends, too many shadows lingering just out of sight. I knew I had to follow the thread of this mysterious correspondence. Further, something told me that Farrington was more involved than he would admit. The butler's calm demeanour, which had once seemed reassuring, now struck me as the perfect mask for a man with something to hide. I had questioned Farrington earlier, of course, but his answers had been carefully measured, his posture as stiff as the starched collar he wore. In those early hours of investigation, I had observed him closely, noting how his eyes darted to the letter with a momentary flicker of recognition when I mentioned it. That small movement, so fleeting, was enough to ignite my suspicion further. I needed to understand the context of this letter. Where had it come from? And why had Farrington kept it hidden in his quarters? The answers, I was certain, would shed light on the larger mystery at hand. I set out to search his room once more. Farrington's quarters were modest but efficient. A simple bed, a worn armchair, a desk stacked with papers, and the expected assortment of personal items. But it was the small cabinet in the corner that caught my attention. It stood slightly ajar, and a glint of something within caught the light. I stepped closer, my gloved fingers gently pulling open the door. And there it was. A second letter. This one was even more cryptic than the first. The paper was heavier, and the handwriting, a slanted script I had not yet encountered, sent a shiver down my spine. It read, "You are running out of time. Do as I say, or everything will be exposed. Meet me tonight. The choice is yours. There is no way back." Beneath the final words, a single name was scrawled. H. Duval. A name I did not recognize. I stood there for a moment, my mind racing. The butler's connection to the letter was now undeniable, but the name of H. Duval was a new puzzle piece I had yet to place. Whoever this was, they were inextricably tied to the Ramsgate family's web of secrets. I carefully folded the letter and returned it to its hiding place, making a mental note to investigate further. But it wasn't just Farrington who occupied my thoughts. No, I had to dig deeper into the events of that fateful night, the night of Lord Ramsgate's death. And so I turned my attention back to the one piece of the puzzle that had always intrigued me. The mysterious visitor seen speaking with Lord Ramsgate earlier that day. I asked around, subtly probing the staff and guests for any mention of a stranger arriving at the estate. But as with everything in this house, the truth was buried beneath layers of deceit. There had been whispers, but no one would confirm much. However, one name kept cropping up in conversation, an old acquaintance of Lord Ramsgate, someone who had been in and out of his life for many years, but whose presence seemed to cause Lord Ramsgate no small amount of distress. A Mr. H. Duval. The name was the same. The name from the letter. The connection, though tenuous at first, was growing clearer. It appeared that the very person who had written the threatening letters to Farrington was the same man who had come to Ramsgate on the day of his death, and it seemed that Farrington too was linked to Duval, whether by blood or by something far darker. I immediately set about finding out more about Mr. Duval, though I knew I would have to tread carefully. His involvement, whatever it was, could change everything. The link between the Ramsgate family, Farrington, and this mysterious figure was a key that might unlock the whole case. But I needed to be sure. Later that afternoon, I returned to the library where I had first found Lord Ramsgate's lifeless form, the cup of tea still resting innocuously beside him. The room was untouched, a silent testament to the murder that had occurred within its walls. I gazed once more at the table where Lord Ramsgate had sat, his final moments seemingly unremarkable. There was no sign of struggle, no indication of violence. And yet, there was the matter of the tea. Had he truly died from natural causes? I still wasn't certain. And then I remembered something Farrington had said when I had first questioned him. "I served Lord Ramsgate his tea," he had said, his voice level. It was a usual routine. There was nothing odd about it. But now I could not help but wonder if the tea had been meant to cover up something more sinister. Perhaps the tea had not been the cause of death, but rather a way to conceal it. I considered that the manner of death, slow and unnoticed, could be the perfect cover for whatever had truly occurred. It was a conversation I would need to revisit with Farrington, no doubt. His composure, I realized, had been growing increasingly fragile. His hands, once steady, were now tremulous when he thought I wasn't watching. and when I had asked about the missing letter earlier, his gaze had lingered on me for a fraction of a second longer than it should have. What was Farrington hiding? What had driven him to keep not one, but two incriminating letters in his possession? I turned back to the matter at hand, the mysterious H. Duval. From the rumours I had gathered, it appeared that Duval had been more than just a passing acquaintance of Lord Ramsgate. There were stories of business dealings gone awry, a man with a temper, and an individual who seemed to have a particular sway over Ramsgate's actions. The picture that was beginning to form was one of blackmail. Perhaps Duval had been pressing Lord Ramsgate for something, money, a change to his will, or something even more valuable. And perhaps Lord Ramsgate, in his attempts to avoid further scandal, had turned to Farrington to help him handle the situation. But it seemed that something had gone terribly wrong. Duval had come to collect on whatever debt he felt was owed to him, and in the process, Lord Ramsgate had been murdered. I spent the remainder of the afternoon in the study, carefully reviewing everything I knew. It was clear that Farrington was far from innocent. But could he have acted alone? Or had someone else, perhaps the elusive Mr. Duval, played a hand in the murder as well? As evening drew near, I stood by the window, the shadows lengthening as the last traces of sunlight faded from the horizon. The pieces were coming together, but there was still much to be done. One thing was certain: the truth would come to light. It always did in the end, and I was determined to be the one to reveal it. But as I stood there, a sudden knock at the door broke my thoughts. It was the butler. His face was pale, his hands clenched tightly together, and there was something deeply unsettling about the way he stood in the doorway. "I must speak with you, monsieur," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It is about Mr. Duval." Chapter 7. Psychological Warfare. The door shut behind Farrington with a soft click, and I was left with a sense of foreboding, an unease that crept into my bones. His visit had not been expected, and yet it had been precisely what I needed. His words, whispered in the quiet of the hallway, had left an indelible mark upon my thoughts. "It is about Mr. Duval." I knew this was no mere coincidence. Farrington's demeanour had shifted entirely from the calm, collected man who had served Lord Ramsgate for years. Now, as he stood in front of me, he was a man on the edge, nervous, cornered, and desperate. I motioned for him to sit. "Speak, Farrington," I urged, my voice calm yet insistent. "What is it about Mr. Duval that you feel must be told now?" Farrington swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he clasped them tightly together. His eyes darted toward the door, as if afraid someone might overhear. His lips parted, then closed, again the words struggling to escape. "You are aware, I presume," he began slowly, his voice low, "that Lord Ramsgate had enemies. There were those who sought to ruin him, to tear apart his reputation. One of them was Duval, a man with influence." I nodded slowly, letting him continue at his own pace. I had known that Mr. Duval was a man of questionable character, but this was the first concrete piece of information I had gained from Farrington. I needed more. "You have mentioned Duval before, but now you speak of him with a certain fear," I observed carefully, noting the subtle shift in Farrington's posture. "Tell me, Farrington, did Duval have something on Lord Ramsgate, something that could have driven him to desperation?" Farrington's gaze dropped to his lap, his fingers twitching restlessly. For a moment he remained silent, and I could see him wrestling with himself, weighing the cost of revealing too much. Then, with a defeated sigh, he nodded, his voice trembling. He had threatened Ramsgate," he admitted, his words barely a whisper. Not with money, not with a simple demand. No, it was something far more dangerous. He had threatened to expose an affair, Lady Ramsgate's affair. I felt a brief flicker of surprise. An affair? I echoed, leaning forward slightly. Lady
Ramsgate? With whom? Farrington looked up, his eyes wild with fear. I don't know, I swear I don't know, but Duval, he had proof. He had a letter, a document that could ruin her reputation, destroy everything.
Ramsgate was desperate. He did everything he could to prevent it from being made public. A letter, a scandal, and a threat to expose the truth about a hidden affair. It seemed a bit too convenient, but the pieces were falling into place and the picture was becoming clearer, though it still lacked crucial detail. Who exactly had the power to control both Lord and Lady Ramsgate? And what had driven Farrington to conceal such information? "Tell me, Farrington," I said, my voice steady, though my mind raced. "If Duval was truly in possession of this letter, why did Ramsgate not deal with him more directly? What role did you play in all of this?" Farrington stiffened at the mention
of his involvement, his face paling. He paused, swallowing hard. I was instructed to meet with Duval to convince him that Ramsgate would give him what he wanted.
But the conversation turned violent. Ramsgate refused to give in, and Duval became enraged. He threatened Ramsgate not only with the letter, but with other things. Things I dare not speak of. A sudden flash of insight struck me. The letter, I thought, was only one part of the equation. Duval wasn't just after money or power, he was after something far more personal. The affair had given him leverage over the Ramsgate family, and it seemed likely that Duval had used this leverage to his advantage. I rose from my chair and began to pace, my mind whirring with the new pieces of the puzzle. I needed to know more about this letter, this elusive piece of blackmail. But Farrington, despite his obvious fear, wasn't yet ready to part with all the details. "I must ask you to consider one thing, monsieur," I said, stopping in front of him. "You say that Duval threatened Ramsgate with this letter. Why, then, did Lord Ramsgate continue to act as though everything was normal? Why did he not confront Duval directly?" Farrington's eyes flickered uneasily, and I saw a momentary lapse in his carefully constructed facade. He had been so intent on protecting Lady Ramsgate, it seemed, that he had overlooked a detail that might prove more important than any of us had initially realized. The butler shifted uneasily. I don't know. Maybe he thought that with time Duval would calm down, that the threat would fade. But he underestimated Duval. Duval became more desperate, more dangerous. I studied Farrington for a moment longer, my mind ticking over the possibilities. Something still didn't sit.
Right.
His nervousness, his vague answers, and the way he avoided eye contact, it all pointed toward a man hiding something deeper than mere fear of Duval. I decided to probe further. There was more to Farrington than met the eye, and it was crucial that I uncover the truth. "You say Duval became desperate," I pressed. "What exactly did he want from Lord Ramsgate, besides the letter? What else could he have been after?" Farrington hesitated again, then leaned forward, his voice barely audible. "He wanted Ramsgate to change his will. He demanded it. Duval knew that Ramsgate was about to revise his will, and he wanted a share of the inheritance. So Duval was not only blackmailing Lord Ramsgate over the affair, but he also had designs on his wealth. A man who was dangerous, yes, but also greedy. A volatile combination." "And did Ramsgate comply?" I asked, pressing the question that had been lingering in my mind. Farrington shook his head, his face grim. No, he refused. That was the final straw. I gave a slow nod, allowing the implications of Farrington's confession to sink in. The will, the letter, the affair, each of these factors had played their part in the deadly game that had unfolded. But one detail still eluded me: the fabric.
Had already seen it once. Torn fabric, matching the butler's uniform, found at the crime scene. It was a strange detail, one that had gnawed at my mind, but I hadn't yet made the connection. But I would.
I would find the answer. I turned to Farrington, my expression unchanging. "There is one more thing, Monsieur Farrington," I said, my voice colder now. "At the scene of Lord Ramsgate's death, a piece of torn fabric was found. It matches the material of your uniform." The look of fear that crossed Farrington's face confirmed my suspicions. I had him now. "Perhaps," I murmured, "you should tell me more about your involvement with Mr. Duval." "Everything." Farrington swallowed hard, his hands trembling. His eyes darted to the door, and for the first time I saw a flicker of guilt and panic flash across his face. "The truth is, it is not as it seems," he whispered. Chapter 8. The butler's past. I sat in my room, the words of Farrington echoing in my mind like the faintest whisper of a breeze, suggesting something more than just a surface. Guilt. He had spoken in fragments as though afraid to reveal too much of himself. A man with secrets, and secrets, as I have often found, are the foundation upon which the most intricate mysteries are built. Yet even as I pondered, my thoughts turned inevitably to Farrington's past. His actions, the tension in his gaze, his nervousness. There was something in his manner that suggested this was not the first time he had found himself embroiled in a scandal. I turned to Captain Hastings, who was seated across from me, his eyes filled with curiosity. He had been quiet since Farrington's hasty retreat, but I could see the question in his expression. "What do you make of it, mon ami?" I asked him, leaning back in my chair. "Farrington knows more than he is willing to say, but there is something in his behavior, something that nags at me." Hastings was silent for a moment, rubbing his chin. "I've been thinking much the same. That fabric at the scene, his reluctance to speak of Mr. Duval, it all adds up to something more than mere fear, Poirot." I nodded, my mind turning over the facts. The butler's guilt was plain to see, but the question remained: what did Farrington stand to gain from Lord Ramsgate's death? A blackmail scheme? No, too simple. There was more to this than that. "I shall look into Farrington's past," I said suddenly. "I believe we have been looking at him through the wrong lens. He is not merely a butler caught in a web of intrigue. No, there is something deeper." Hastings looked at me, his brow furrowing. "You think he's been involved in something like this before?" "Indeed, I do." I stood up abruptly, walking to the window. Outside, the trees were shaking off the last remnants of autumn's grip, their bare branches casting long shadows over the estate grounds. "Farrington is no stranger to tragedy, mon ami. And what we see here, the guilt, the tension, it speaks to a past that is haunting him still." I turned back to Hastings. "Come, let us speak with someone who may know more of Farrington's past." The servant quarters were not far from the main house, a modest set of rooms nestled at the rear of the estate. I was aware that the staff held their own stories, often guarded with the same suspicion that one reserves for family secrets. I made my way to the maid, Miss Adelaide, a quiet young woman with a delicate disposition, who had worked at Ramsgate for several years. She had always seemed pleasant enough, but today there was an air of apprehension about her. We sat together in the small, dimly lit room where she had agreed to speak with us. Hastings stood by the door, ever the watchful presence. Miss Adelaide had been particularly close to Farrington, often serving alongside him, and it was through her eyes that I hoped to understand the butler's true nature. "I trust you know why I have come, Miss Adelaide," I said gently, taking a seat opposite her. She nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Yes, Mr. Poirot,
I know you've been asking about Mr. Farrington. Everyone is talking about it. I suppose it's only right that you hear it from me." I leaned forward slightly, my eyes narrowing with interest. "What is it you know about Farrington? There."
"Is much about his past that troubles me." For a moment, Miss Adelaide seemed unsure, her eyes flickering toward the door, before returning to my face. He's always been a good man, sir," she began hesitantly. "But there was something before he came to work for Lord Ramsgate, something terrible." I raised an eyebrow, urging her to continue. "Go on, Miss Adelaide." The young woman glanced at Hastings, her nerves evident, but she continued, nonetheless. "He used to work for the Winterbournes. They were a wealthy family in Hampshire, you see. Mr. Winterbourne, the father, was a well-known gentleman, but their son Richard, he died under very mysterious circumstances." I felt the familiar tightening in my chest. Another tragedy, another death. But this one, unlike Lord Ramsgate's, had been cloaked in an even more sinister veil. I motioned for her to go on. "Richard Winterbourne was a troubled young man," Miss Adelaide continued, her voice dropping. "He had a temper.
And one night, during a gathering similar to Lord Ramsgate's dinner, he was found dead in the garden. They said it was an accident, an argument that had gotten out of hand. But I don't believe it. I think there was more to it." I leaned in, intrigued. "What makes you say that?"
She looked away, her face pale. "I think Mr. Farrington knows more than he's letting on. He was there that night, you see. He was the one who found Mr. Winterbourne's body. And since then, well—" She trailed off, her voice faltering. "Since then," I prompted, "since then Mr. Farrington has always been haunted. He never speaks of it, but there's always a shadow over him. And when Mr. Winterbourne's death was ruled an accident, no one questioned it. But I think Farrington did, and—"
"I think—" She hesitated. "I think he's afraid it could happen again." I sat back, digesting the information.
A young man dead under suspicious circumstances, a butler who had been there, and now a history that seemed to echo the current situation with Lord Ramsgate. Could Farrington's past involvement in a mysterious death have affected his actions? Here, had he been driven by guilt, by fear, or by something darker altogether? "Miss Adelaide," I said carefully, "did you ever hear anything that might connect Mr. Farrington to Mr. Winterbourne's death? Anything that would suggest he was involved?" The maid looked uncomfortable, her eyes darting to the side, as if she were unsure whether to reveal more. I don't know, sir, but sometimes when I'd overhear him talking to himself, he'd mention it. Richard Winterbourne's name. It always sounded like he was blaming himself. I could feel the pieces of the puzzle slowly falling into place. Farrington's past, a past tied to a similar tragedy, was no coincidence. It seemed now more than ever that this was the key to understanding his involvement in Lord Ramsgate's death. "And what about the Winterbournes?" I asked, my thoughts racing. "What happened to them?" Miss Adelaide's face tightened. "Mr. Winterbourne disappeared after Richard's death. No one knows where he went. Some say he's living abroad. But Mrs. Winterbourne, she never recovered. She left the estate soon after, too." I rose from my seat, feeling the weight of what I had just learned. Farrington had been part of another family's destruction, perhaps a victim of circumstance, perhaps complicit in something darker. But his past, whatever it was undeniably linked to the death of Lord Ramsgate. "Thank you, Miss Adelaide," I said softly. "You have been most helpful." As we left the servant quarters, Hastings fell into step beside me, his face grave. "So Farrington's past is as murky as his present. What now, Poirot?" I paused, looking out over the grounds.
"Of Ramsgate."
"Now, Hastings, we see if Farrington is truly a man with a troubled conscience or a man with a secret too dangerous to expose." Chapter 9. Twists and turns. I stood in the dim light of the study, the weight of the investigation pressing heavily
On me. The pieces were all before me, spread out like a jigsaw puzzle that refused to reveal its true picture.
I had examined the letter, the strange compartment in Farrington's uniform, the accusations, the suspicion in the eyes of the guests, and the signs of a deep-seated guilt in the butler. Yet despite all these clues, there was a nagging sense that I was missing something crucial. The teacup, so innocuously placed beside Lord Ramsgate's body, had remained an enigma, one that continually haunted my thoughts. The poison, I had deduced, had been introduced in such a manner that it suggested subtlety, craftsmanship even. The more I thought about it, the more I realized it was not just the act of poisoning that had caught my attention, it was the way the cup had been tampered with. It had been carefully handled, altered, manipulated in a way that suggested the intention was not simply to kill, but to make the death appear natural. A cunning plan indeed. I turned to Hastings, who had been waiting by the door, his patience, as always, a steady companion. "It is quite clear now," I began slowly, my voice deliberate. "Lord Ramsgate's death was no accident, nor was it—"
An immediate result of poisoning. No, mon ami, it was a calculated murder, crafted in such a way as to disguise the true cause.
Hastings frowned, stepping closer. "What are you saying, Poirot? You mean someone went to the trouble of making it seem like natural causes?" I nodded. "Precisely. The poison was introduced in a clever fashion, just enough to kill him, but not enough to immediately draw attention. A death by natural causes is always the preferred disguise. But there is something else. Something far more disturbing." I could feel Hastings' eyes on me, searching for more. "What else?" "The teacup," I said, my voice low. "It has been altered. The poison was administered in a way that ensured Lord Ramsgate would fall unconscious, not immediately collapse. This suggests the person who poisoned him wanted time. Time to manipulate the scene. Time to plant evidence that would reinforce the notion of a natural death." I watched as Hastings processed the information. "So, someone made it look like a heart attack, or something of the sort?" "Exactly," I replied. But why? Why go to such lengths to conceal the cause of death, unless they were trying to hide something far deeper? A deeper motive, perhaps? We both fell silent, each of us turning over this new realization. It seemed so simple when laid out in front
Of us, yet so much more complicated than we had initially thought. Hastings suddenly straightened, a look of realization crossing his face.
But Poirot, how did they know exactly how Lord Ramsgate would react to the poison? I shook my head, a small smile playing at the corners of my lips. That, my friend, is the most intriguing part of all. Whoever is behind this has knowledge. Knowledge
Of Lord Ramsgate's health, his habits, and most importantly, his weaknesses. This was no random act, it was an act of precision. Just as I was about to delve deeper into this thought, there was a sharp knock at the door.
I turned sharply to face the interruption. Farrington! His pale face appeared in the doorway, his eyes darting nervously between Hastings and me. I must speak with you, Mr. Poirot," he said, his voice strained, though he made an effort to maintain his composure. I believe I know who did it." I could not help but raise an eyebrow at his sudden outburst. "Ah, mon ami," I said calmly. "I thought you might have been hiding something more than your usual hesitations."
Come in, come in. Do tell me what it is you believe you know." Farrington hesitated for a moment longer before stepping into the room.
He shut the door behind him with a soft click, as if ensuring no one could overhear. I have been thinking," he said, his voice low, "and I believe I know who the murderer is. It's—" Before he could finish, I raised a hand to silence him, my gaze locking with his. "I am listening, Mr. Farrington, but let us not rush to conclusions, yes? Let us first consider the facts. You say you know who did it, but you are certain of nothing, are you not?" Farrington swallowed, clearly nervous, and for a moment his confidence faltered. I suppose not, but I know something. I believe I am being framed." "Uh-huh," I said softly. "Framed, you say? And why do you believe that?" He hesitated again, clearly unsure of how much to reveal. Finally, he spoke, his words tumbling out. Last night, after the dinner, I went to Lord Ramsgate's study. He was alone. He had been drinking, and when I entered he seemed agitated. He told me he had just received a letter that was troubling him." I raised an eyebrow.
"And what was in the letter, Mr. Farrington?" "I don't know, sir. I didn't see it. But I heard him mention something about the inheritance. He was worried about his will, about who would get what. And what happened next? I—"
"Left him there, sir," Farrington continued, his voice shaky. "I went back to my quarters. But later, after I learned of Lord Ramsgate's death, I was told there was a letter found at the scene, a letter that had been torn." I leaned forward, my mind already racing. "A torn letter, you say? Very interesting." Farrington nodded vigorously. "I'm sure it's the same letter, I'm sure of it, and I'm sure someone planted it there to make it seem like I was
involved." I studied him for a moment, considering his words. It was a confession of sorts, but it lacked the clarity I had hoped for. He was still hiding something, I could feel it. "Tell me, Mr. Farrington," I said, my voice calm but firm.
"What was in the letter that made Lord Ramsgate so agitated?"
"You said it was about the inheritance. Who stood to gain the most from his death?" Farrington's face turned pale, his hands trembling. I don't know, sir. It's not something I should say, but..." At that moment, my mind
snapped to attention. A flash of something, a half-formed memory, surfaced. I had seen a detail in Farrington's uniform earlier, a tear in the fabric that had caught my eye. It seemed insignificant at the time, but now it made sense. "The tear in your uniform," I said suddenly, my voice sharp. "It matches the fabric found at the scene. Do you care to explain that, Mr. Farrington?" Farrington's eyes
widened in horror, and for the first time I saw genuine fear in his expression.
He opened his mouth to speak, but closed it again, as if realizing the enormity of what he had just revealed. "It seems," I said softly, "that all is not as it seems, Mr. Farrington. But do not worry. We shall soon uncover the truth." Farrington, his face drained of colour, nodded mutely. He was trapped now, his fate sealed by his own hesitations and lies. But there was more to this than Farrington's guilty conscience. I could feel it. The real truth was still out there, hidden in the tangled web of lies and deceit that had ensnared them all. As I turned away from him, I knew the puzzle was closer to completion. But there was one final question that remained. What was the true motive behind Lord Ramsgate's death? And I would stop at nothing until I uncovered it. Chapter 10. False Leads. The evening was growing colder, and the quiet of the estate pressed in on us like a thick fog. The steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed unnervingly loud as I stood in the dimly lit study, the weight of the investigation hanging over me like a heavy cloak. We had come to a point where it felt as though every lead had been exhausted, every possible angle explored, yet something was still amiss. The pieces of the puzzle did not fit, and I found myself staring at the same clues, hoping they would reveal their meaning. But they remained stubbornly silent. I turned to Hastings, who had been unusually quiet since our conversation with Farrington. "Mon ami, I begin to wonder whether we are chasing shadows," I said, my voice betraying the slightest hint of frustration. "We have examined Farrington's past, his actions, and yet something does not sit right." Hastings, as always, was eager to offer his thoughts. "But Poirot, surely we're closer now. Farrington's torn uniform, his strange behaviour. He must have something to do with it."
And don't forget about that letter. It seems clear that something was going on with the inheritance. I nodded, but a lingering doubt gnawed at me. Yes, but too many things do not add up. Farrington's sudden confession, his trembling hands, they
Suggest guilt, but at the same time they smell of desperation, and desperate people often make mistakes. I believe we are being misled, Hastings. There is more to this than meets the eye. At that moment, the door to the study creaked open, and a figure appeared in the doorway, one of the other servants, a young man named Edmund. His face was pale, and his hands were visibly shaking as he stepped into the room.
"Mr. Poirot," Edmund said, his voice trembling, I have something to confess." I exchanged a quick glance with Hastings. Here it was, another piece of the puzzle, or so it seemed, but I did not allow myself to be too easily swayed. "Come in, Edmund," I said calmly, gesturing for him to sit. "Tell me what you have to say."
He sat down stiffly, his eyes darting nervously around the room. I was with Mr. Farrington the night of Lord Ramsgate's death. I saw him leave the study, looking guilty, like he had done something wrong. I don't know what came over me, but I felt I had to tell you. I didn't want to be involved, but now I am."
I should have said something sooner. I sat back, observing him carefully. His words seemed sincere, but there was something about his demeanour that raised an alarm in my mind. He was speaking too quickly, his movements too erratic. "So, Edmund,"
I said slowly, "you were with Mr. Farrington just before Lord Ramsgate's death."
"And you saw him leave the study in an agitated state?" The young man nodded vigorously. "Yes, that's right. He was upset. I saw him go into the study, and after a while he came out looking like he had just been caught in some terrible crime. I thought he might have done something to Lord Ramsgate." I leaned forward, considering the implications of this new information.
The servant's confession had all the hallmarks of a classic red herring. Too much information, too many details that seemed just a bit too convenient. It fit perfectly with the pattern I had begun to see, a well-executed deception designed to lead us astray.
"And what exactly did you see, Edmund?" I asked, keeping my tone measured, though my mind raced. "Did you hear anything? Did you see anyone else in the study?" Edmund hesitated, his hands wringing together. I didn't hear anything, mister. Poirot, but I saw him come out of the study, and his eyes were wide with fear. I thought he might have been involved. And you did not see anyone else? I pressed. No, sir, no one else was there, Edmund replied, shaking his head. It was just Mr. Farrington. I didn't see anyone else enter the room. I let the silence stretch for a moment as I thought through
Edmund's story. It was plausible, too plausible in fact. The young man was doing his best to play the part of a concerned, guilt-ridden servant, but his nervous energy and the simplicity of his account made me suspicious. He had left too much unsaid, and his confession, while compelling, did not ring true. I leaned back in my chair, my fingers steepled in front of me as I regarded Edmund with a steady gaze. "Thank you for your honesty, Edmund," I said, my voice calm but firm. "You will be questioned further, of course, but for now, you are free to go." Edmund rose quickly, almost too quickly, and fled the room without another word. I turned to Hastings, who had been listening intently to the exchange. "Did
You see it, Hastings?" I asked, my voice soft.
the lie beneath the confession?" Hastings blinked in confusion. "What do you mean, Poirot?" I let out a small sigh. The boy's confession was far too convenient. He gave us just enough information to sound believable, but not enough to be useful. He spoke of Farrington's behaviour, of seeing him leave the study. But why, then, would he not have heard anything? Why was he in such a hurry to confess when he had been nowhere near the crime scene? I stood up and began pacing the room, my mind turning over the new piece of information. "No, mon ami, Edmund's story does not hold water. Someone has been feeding him lines, and now he believes them himself." Hastings, ever the loyal companion, nodded slowly. "So you think he's lying?" "Indeed," I said. "But why would he lie? Why would he choose to confess to something he didn't do?" "It doesn't add up. This is the real question, Hastings. Who benefits from framing Farrington, and why would they involve Edmund?" Hastings raised an eyebrow. "But Poirot, if Edmund wasn't involved, who do you suspect now?" I paused, my eyes narrowing in thought. "I do not know yet, mon ami, but I will find out. There is one thing I do know for certain. We are being misled. The truth is hiding beneath layers of lies, and the greatest deception is one that lies beneath the surface. We must dig deeper." The door creaked open again, and Farrington entered the room. His eyes were wide, and his face had taken on a strange, almost guilty expression. "Mr. Poirot," he said, his voice shaking, I have something else to confess." I turned to face him, my mind already racing. "You have something else to confess." "Mr. Farrington," I repeated, my voice calm but laden with meaning. "Very well, you may begin." Farrington's eyes darted nervously from one of us to the other, his hand reaching into his coat pocket as if searching for something. But before he could speak, I knew that whatever he was about to say would only deepen the mystery. "Tell me, Mr. Farrington," I said, my voice low and measured, "what is it you believe you must confess?" Chapter 11. Motives and Lies. Unravel, the tension in the room was palpable. Each member of the Ramsgate family seemed to shrink into themselves as though their guilt was too heavy to bear openly. Their fidgeting, the way they averted their gaze whenever I glanced in their direction, only confirmed that the murder had uncovered more than just the loss of a man. They had lost their peace of mind as well. Each was a suspect, each a piece of the puzzle that I could not yet arrange. I sat in the drawing room, alone with my thoughts for a moment. The investigation had come to a crossroads. I had examined every detail, cross-examined every servant, questioned every guest. And yet nothing about Lord Ramsgate's death seemed straightforward. The poison in his tea, the conflicting testimonies, the letters, the fabric torn from Farrington's uniform, it all pointed to something darker than mere inheritance greed. But the how and the when remained elusive, as if hidden behind layers of half-truths and manipulation. "What do you think?"
Mon ami?
I asked softly, turning to Hastings, who had been silently observing the proceedings. Hastings had been unusually quiet of late, his own thoughts consumed by the complexity of the case. He took a deep breath, as though steeling himself for a difficult
answer. "I think there's something we're missing, Poirot. All the evidence points to Farrington, yet I don't know. It's too obvious. No one's perfect in these situations. Maybe it's a diversion."
"Maybe we're not seeing the real killer." I nodded, my mind already working through his words. "Perhaps. But I cannot dismiss Farrington just yet. The torn uniform, the letters, the strange behaviour, all led back to him, don't they?" Hastings gave a small shrug. "They do, but maybe we're too focused on Farrington. Maybe the real killer is someone closer to Lord Ramsgate, someone who's been hiding in plain sight, someone with motive and opportunity." "You speak of the family," I said, leaning forward, my fingers steepled in contemplation. "Yes, there are deep-seated animosities there, resentments that run deeper than any of them care to admit." I stood and began pacing, my thoughts growing more focused with each step. The Ramsgate family, despite their outward composure, was fraught with secrets. There were rivalries, betrayals, and unspoken histories that had festered for years. Lady Ramsgate, for instance, had always been the elegant wife, a silent player in the background of her husband's wealth and power. Yet her affair had come to light, a piece of the puzzle I had only recently uncovered. Then there was her son Charles, whose ambitions far exceeded the inheritance he stood to receive. And finally, the daughter, Lily, who seemed perpetually on edge, as though something or someone was threatening her very existence. "The family," I mused aloud, "each one of them stands to gain something from Ramsgate's death. The mother, the son, the daughter, even the distant relatives who might have quietly envied Ramsgate's position, they all had something to gain." Hastings raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. "But none of them had a clear opportunity, did they? They all seemed to be accounted for at the time of the murder." "Ah, but opportunity is an elusive thing, mon ami," I said, turning to face him. "We must look at not just who had the means, but who had the opportunity, and who, in their desperation, would have gone to such lengths to conceal their actions." I turned back to the room, my eyes scanning the gathered family members. They were all there, seated in a half-circle, their faces frozen masks of composure. But beneath the surface, I knew they were seething with fear, guilt, and a certain twisted form of loyalty to one another. They were desperate to protect their own interests, to shield themselves from the fallout that would come with the truth. Lady Ramsgate sat at the centre, her once perfect hair now dishevelled, her eyes darting nervously between her family and me. Her usual aloofness was replaced by a barely contained anxiety, as though she feared every word that left her lips might be her undoing. I decided then to confront them all in a way I hadn't done before, directly. With all the subtlety I had, used in previous interrogations now discarded, I stood before them, my gaze sweeping from one to the other. "I know you are all hiding something," I said calmly. "There are lies between you, secrets that none of you wish to acknowledge, but I will uncover the truth, and when I do, you will all be exposed for the roles you have played in this tragedy." The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. Lady Ramsgate's lips trembled slightly, but she said nothing. Charles shifted, uncomfortably in his seat, his gaze avoiding mine. Lily, however, looked directly at me, her eyes blazing with a mixture of defiance and fear. "You think we are guilty?" Charles scoffed, his voice rough with contempt. "What do you know about us? Poirot, we've done nothing but mourn our father. And now you accuse us of murder. What sort of game are you playing?" I held his gaze without flinching. "I am playing no game, mon ami. I am simply searching for the truth, as I always do, and the truth will come out no matter how much you try."
"To bury it!" Lady Ramsgate suddenly stood up, her voice rising in a near hysterical pitch. "This is absurd! You think we would murder him, our own flesh and blood? How dare you?" Her hand trembled as she reached for her chair, and I noticed that
the familiar poise she had once displayed was gone, replaced by the rawness of her emotions. Her outburst did little to convince me. "Lady Ramsgate, your distress is noted," I said quietly. "But it is not the first time I have seen such an act. People in your position, people who are losing everything they once held dear, will do anything to protect themselves. And you, Madame, had much to lose." The tension in the room escalated, and I could see the other family members growing increasingly uncomfortable. It was clear that my words had struck a nerve. But it was Charles who spoke next, his voice low, but filled with barely contained rage. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he said. "You don't know what it's like, being stuck in a family like this, the constant power struggles, the jealousy, the lies. You have no idea what we've been through." His outburst caught me off guard, and for the first time I saw a crack in his carefully constructed facade. His resentment was palpable, his anger simmering just below the surface. And in that moment I realized something crucial. His words were not just a defense, they were a confession. A confession of his deep-seated animosity toward his father, and perhaps of the lengths he might have gone to in order to inherit the wealth he so desperately craved. The silence in the room stretched on, thick with the weight of his admission. I could almost hear the pieces falling into place. Charles had the motive. But what about the opportunity? I turned my gaze toward Lily, who had been strangely quiet throughout the confrontation. Her face, usually so controlled, was pale, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She was hiding something, of that I was certain. But what? And why had she remained silent when her brother had all but confessed? "Do you have anything to add, Miss Ramsgate?" I asked softly. She met my gaze for the first time, her eyes wide with fear. For a moment, she said nothing. Then in a voice barely above a whisper, she replied, "I don't want to be part of this. I never wanted any of it." Her words hung in the air, and I realized that for all her fear, she was hiding something far more dangerous than any of the others had revealed, something more than just a motive, something that in the end might reveal the identity of the killer. Chapter 12. The Grand Confrontation. The investigation had stretched on for days, each moment laden with the same gnawing uncertainty, as though the answers were just beyond my grasp. The Ramsgate family, despite their outward composure, were clearly on edge, and it had become evident to me that this web of deceit was not only woven tightly, but also tangled with deeply rooted resentments. Yet, every time I thought I was on the verge of uncovering the truth, something new would emerge, forcing me to reevaluate everything I thought I knew. I had gathered the suspects once again, this time in the library of Ramsgate Manor, the large, dimly lit room with its high ceilings and rows of bookshelves felt almost oppressive, as though the walls themselves were closing in on us. The heavy silence among the gathered family members was only broken by the occasional creak of the floorboards as they shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Each one of them was a potential murderer. But which one? Hastings stood nearby, his brow furrowed in concentration. We had seen the signs, the tension between the family members, the looks of suspicion, the small gestures that betrayed their anxiety. But now it was time for the truth to be revealed. The final confrontation was upon us. I took my seat at the head of the long table and surveyed the group. Lady Ramsgate, sitting rigidly with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, seemed the picture of composure, but I knew better. Charles, her son, was the opposite. His hands were clenched into fists, his jaw set in a permanent scowl. Lily, the daughter, appeared unusually calm, but her eyes darted nervously between the others, and her face remained pale, almost ghostly. Farrington, the butler, stood slightly apart from the rest, his usual composure replaced by a subtle unease. "I have called you here today," I began, my voice steady but carrying the weight of the situation, "because we have reached the point in this investigation where only the truth can bring closure to this tragic affair." I paused, letting the words sink in, watching the subtle reactions of each of them. Lady Ramsgate's lips twitched, Charles shifted in his seat, and Lily, still as a statue, seemed to brace herself for something that she knew was coming. Farrington, for the first time, didn't meet my eyes. "You all have motives, and you—"
"All have secrets," I continued, "but one of you has lied so boldly, so brazenly, that I can no longer ignore it. We have come to the point where the puzzle is nearly complete, but I still need one final piece, and it is a piece
that will bring all of this together." There was a collective intake of breath, and I could see the unease growing among them. They were beginning to realize that the moment they had all dreaded was finally here. I turned to Lady Ramsgate first, my gaze lingering on her for just a moment longer than usual. Her facade of mourning and restraint cracked slightly, and I caught a glimpse of something else, something darker. "Lady Ramsgate," I said softly, "it is clear to me that you were not as grief-stricken as you appeared on the surface. In fact, your emotions seemed carefully controlled. Too controlled, if I may say so." She stiffened, but kept her voice steady.
"I don't know what you mean, Monsieur Poirot. My husband's death has been devastating to me."
"But of course," I agreed, nodding politely. "But there is something else. You were not merely the wife of a man you loved, but also of a man you feared. You were trapped in a marriage that had become untenable, and I suspect that you were not
"As innocent as you wish to appear." Her lips parted slightly in surprise, but she quickly recovered. "That is preposterous. I love my husband despite his faults."
I took a step closer, my gaze never leaving hers. "Ah, but the truth is often hidden in plain sight. You may have loved him in your own way, Lady Ramsgate, but there were darker feelings there as well. I found your diary hidden in your room."
"And in it, you reveal feelings of contempt, of anger toward your late husband. You speak of his cruelty and how you despised the life he had forced upon you." I let the words hang in the air, watching her face blanch as though the air had been sucked from the room. "You read my private thoughts?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How dare you—" "Calm yourself, madame," I interrupted gently. "You must not confuse anger with guilt, but you have your reasons, do you not? The diary speaks of the way you would have freed yourself from Ramsgate, how you dreamt of his death to escape a life of oppression."
"The inheritance would have been your means of escape, and it is the most obvious motive," Lady Ramsgate's face paled, but she shook her head. "You are mistaken, Poirot. You know nothing of the pressures I endured. The man I married was not the man I thought I knew." I turned away from her and focused on Charles, who had been growing more restless with each passing second.
"And you, Charles," I said, my voice growing more pointed. "Your ambitions have been laid bare for all to see. You resent your father for withholding your inheritance. You resent the way he treated you. His death would have been a sweet release."
"Would it not?" Charles snapped his head toward me, his eyes flashing with rage. "I didn't," he started, but his voice faltered. He closed his mouth with a sharp, angry gesture. "What are you implying, Poirot?" "I am not implying anything, Charles," I replied calmly. "I am simply stating the facts. You wanted your father gone, and you had the means and opportunity to do so. Your temper is well known, and your relationship with your father was strained. Your behavior these past days, angry, defensive, suggests a man with much to hide." He scowled, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something that bordered on fear. "I did not kill my father." "I did not say you did," I replied with a slight smile. "But it is clear that you have a great deal of resentment toward him." I turned my attention to Lily, who had been silent for the most part. Her eyes were wide with anxiety, her hands twisting in her lap. "And you, Miss Ramsgate?" I said softly. "You have been hiding something from me as well, have you not?" She jumped slightly, her gaze darting away. "What do you mean?" she asked, in a voice that was far too high-pitched. "Your silence speaks volumes," I said, my tone gentle but insistent. "You were the only one who did not speak during the argument between your brother and me. You knew, did you not? You knew something important. Perhaps, like your mother, you sought the death of your father to escape the life he had forced upon—"
She began, but stopped abruptly, her face turning a deep shade of red.
Her eyes flickered toward Farrington, who was standing off to the side, observing the scene with a keen but detached expression. It was then that I noticed something, a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. Farrington, who had been so composed, until now seemed suddenly uneasy. His gaze was darting nervously from person to person, his normally stoic expression faltering.
"Ah, Farrington," I said, turning to him. "You have been unusually quiet throughout all of this. I wonder, did you know more than you let on? After all, you were the one who was closest to Ramsgate in his final hours." He stiffened visibly. "I
"Don't know what you mean, Poirot. I was simply doing my duties." I studied him for a moment longer. Then, with deliberate slowness, I asked, "But Farrington, did you not once work for a family where a similar tragedy occurred? A young man?"
A son who met with a mysterious death."
Farrington's face drained of colour, and I could see the panic rise in his eyes. I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered. "No, Farrington," I said, my voice firm. "You do. You are hiding something, something important. And your connection to the past will be the key to unraveling this mystery." There was a long silence as Farrington seemed to retreat within himself, the facade he had carefully constructed crumbling under the pressure of the truth. "We are almost there, Hastings," I whispered to my friend, who had been standing quietly at my side, absorbing every word. "The little grey cells are telling me that we are very close, but one last piece remains." The tension in the room was unbearable. The final truth I knew was just within reach. One more revelation, one more confession, and this twisted puzzle would be solved. Chapter 13. The Puzzle Falls into Place. The air in the library had thickened with a sense of inevitable conclusion, and as I stood there, watching the members of the Ramsgate family squirm in their chairs, a profound stillness descended. The little grey cells had been working relentlessly in my mind, weaving through the details and the misdirections that had cluttered this case from the very beginning. Each conversation, each subtle shift in behaviour had brought me closer to the truth, and now, finally, the pieces of the puzzle had come together. I took a slow, deliberate step forward and cast my gaze over the assembled family, their faces drawn and expectant. They were like characters in a play, each playing their part in this drama, yet none of them fully aware of the true plot that had been written behind the scenes. The tragedy of Lord Ramsgate's death had been a carefully orchestrated performance, and it was time for the final act. "Mon ami, Hastings," I said, turning briefly to my companion. "It is always the smallest detail that proves most significant, is it not? The one fact that, when examined, pulls everything else into place." Hastings nodded thoughtfully, but he could not hide the question that still lingered in his eyes. I could sense it, his silent inquiry. What was that detail? "Indeed," I continued, pacing slowly before the gathered suspects. "At first we had so many theories, each one plausible in its own right. Lady Ramsgate's coldness, Charles's resentment, Lily's silence, Farrington's peculiar behaviour. But I was missing something crucial, something that tied it all together." I stopped in front of Farrington, the butler, who was still standing stiffly by the fireplace. His pallor had deepened since my earlier remarks, and his nervousness was almost palpable. But now, with the final pieces falling into place, I could see that Farrington, though complicit in the web of deception, was not the one who had killed
Lord Ramsgate. "You, Farrington," I began, my tone calm but laden with conviction, "were the key to unlocking this entire mystery. You knew of the affair between Lord Ramsgate and another woman, an affair that had led to a blackmail scheme. You
held the power to ruin Ramsgate's reputation, and with that power came the leverage you needed to manipulate him." Farrington's face tightened, and for a moment I thought he might speak up. But he remained silent, his lips trembling as if he were weighing the consequences of a confession. "Yes," I continued, "Ramsgate was being blackmailed, and you were the one who held the threat over his head."
"But that alone does not make you the murderer, does it, Farrington?" His shoulders slumped slightly as if a great weight had been lifted, but his silence spoke volumes. His guilt was not in the murder itself, but in his part in the sordid affair
that had contributed to the tragedy. "No," I said, with finality, "you were not the one who killed Lord Ramsgate, but you did play your role in the sequence of events that led to his death." The others exchanged uneasy glances, clearly unsure of where this conversation was headed. I could feel their apprehension, but I knew that the final revelation was at hand. Turning away from Farrington, I addressed the family once more, my voice steady, but with an edge of finality. "It was not Farrington who killed Lord Ramsgate," I repeated, "but it was someone else in this room, someone who had far more to lose than any of you realized." The tension in the room was palpable now. I could hear the faint rustle of clothing, the subtle shuffling of feet as they shifted in their chairs, waiting for the inevitable truth to be revealed. Lady Ramsgate, Charles, Lily, all of them were caught in the trap of their own secrets. But it was Charles who was the most visibly shaken, his face contorting as though he had just been struck by a blow. "You see," I continued, "there were two significant motives behind Lord Ramsgate's death, the inheritance and the desire to stop the blackmail. But one person in this house stood to gain the most from both of these motives." I paused, letting the weight of my words settle over them before I looked directly at Charles. "You, Charles," I said quietly. "You are the one who had everything to gain. You were the one who could not bear the thought of being passed over for the inheritance. Your father was withholding it from you, just as he had withheld his affection and approval all your life. But there was more. You also knew about the affair, and when Farrington threatened to expose your father's shame, you knew you had to act." Charles's face drained of colour, and for a brief moment I thought he might collapse under the weight of his guilt. His breath quickened, and his eyes darted around the room as though searching for a way out. But there was no escape now. The truth was laid bare before him. "You killed your father," I stated, the words hanging in the air like a final judgment. "You killed him not out of hatred, but out of necessity. You had to silence him to end the blackmail and to secure your future." Charles opened his mouth as though to protest, but the words caught in his throat. I could see him struggling, his mind racing to come up with a defense, but there was no defense. The evidence was overwhelming, the logic irrefutable. "You tampered with the tea," I continued, "but you didn't poison it directly. You used a subtler method. You spiked the cup with a drug that mimicked the effects of a natural death, something that would cause Lord Ramsgate to slip quietly into unconsciousness. And you did it in a way that would make it appear as though he had merely passed away peacefully. But you underestimated one thing, Charles. You underestimated the power of the little grey cells." Charles's eyes flickered, with a mixture of rage and fear, but he didn't speak. The truth was too much for him to bear, and yet he knew it was undeniable. "Farrington," I said, turning back to the butler, "you were not the murderer, but your actions played a part in the larger scheme. You were blackmailing Lord Ramsgate, but it was Charles who took advantage of your threat to push his father into the grave. The inheritance was his, and the blackmail was ended, but it was not enough. He was still bound by the truth of his actions." The room fell into an eerie silence. Lady Ramsgate sat rigid, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief. Lily appeared almost faint, her face ashen. Farrington, though initially relieved, now looked upon Charles with a new understanding, an understanding of the true depths of his guilt. Charles, now cornered and stripped of his defences, slumped forward in his chair, his face drawn and hollow.
"I didn't mean to. It wasn't supposed to happen like this," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "I just wanted him to stop. I wanted my chance. I thought if he died quietly, it would all be over." "You were wrong," I said, my voice
steady and calm. "It is never over. The truth, like a persistent shadow, always finds its way into the light." The room was heavy with the weight of his confession, and I knew that the case had finally been solved. But the emotional cost, what it had done to the Ramsgate family, would never be fully understood. Lord Ramsgate had been the victim, but, in the end, it was his own blood that had condemned him. I turned to Hastings, who had been watching the scene unfold in silence, his expression one of quiet resignation. "The little grey cells, mon ami," I said softly. "They have done their work. The solution is now clear." Hastings gave a solemn nod, but there was no joy in the resolution, only the stark finality of the truth. As I stood there, staring at the faces of the remaining Ramsgate family, I couldn't help but wonder about the nature of justice. In the end, it wasn't the blackmail, nor the inheritance, nor the secret affairs that had been the true motive for murder. It was something far simpler, human greed wrapped in the guise of desperation, and that, as always, was the most dangerous thing of all. Chapter 14. A final twist. The tension in the library was suffocating, a stillness that seemed to stretch for eternity, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece. I could feel the eyes of the Ramsgate family members boring into me, a mix of disbelief, fear, and guilt etched across their faces. I had laid out the truth piece by piece with methodical precision, and yet there was still one more layer to peel back, one final truth that would completely shatter their already fragile world. I took a deliberate step forward, my eyes scanning the room. Charles, his face a mask of defeat, sat hunched in his chair as if he could no longer bear to look at anyone. Farrington, ever so still, stood with his arms folded, his expression unreadable, though the faint glint of anxiety in his eyes betrayed him. Lady Ramsgate was pale, her hands trembling ever so slightly in her lap, while Lily had long since sunk into a state of shock, her gaze unfocused and distant. "Mon ami Hastings," I began quietly, my voice cutting through the suffocating silence. "I do not believe it was merely greed or desperation that drove the killer to murder. No, there was something much deeper at play, something that perhaps none of us had truly considered until now." Hastings, ever faithful, looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "What do you mean, Poirot?" he asked, his voice low. I could see the others bristle at the implication of my words. They all knew deep down that the final revelation was coming, but none could predict just how far-reaching that revelation would be. "The mind of a murderer," I continued, "is a complex thing.
Often we focus on the obvious, the means, the opportunity, the motive, but there is always something more subtle, something hidden in the past, lurking in the shadows. And it is this hidden truth that brings the real murderer to the surface."
I turned my gaze back to Lady Ramsgate. She was still, unnervingly still, but her eyes flickered toward me as if she had somehow sensed the shift in the air. "Lady Ramsgate," I said, my voice calm but with a slight undercurrent of intensity, "you
"Have been silent throughout most of this investigation."
You have carefully concealed your emotions, as a lady of your stature is trained to do. But what if I told you that your silence is the very key to this case?" Her eyes widened, but she remained composed. "I do not know what you mean, monsieur." "Poirot," she said, her voice icy but controlled. I smiled, a small, knowing smile. "You see, Lady Ramsgate, you have been playing a very clever game all along. You have carefully cultivated the image of a distraught wife, a woman devastated by her husband's death, but in reality, you were far from the innocent victim you pretended to be." Her breath caught for the briefest moment. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, a flash of panic before it was gone, replaced by an impervious mask. "I beg your pardon," she said coldly. "I am in no way responsible for what has occurred." "No, madam," I said, my voice growing firmer. "You are not directly responsible for the murder itself, but you are responsible for the circumstances that
led to it. The room was now heavy with anticipation, the weight of unspoken truths pressing down on each person in turn.
I allowed a pause to hang in the air before continuing, ensuring every eye was on me. "It was you," I said at last, "who discovered your husband's secret. The affair, the blackmail, all of it. But it was not the knowledge of his infidelity that drove you to act. It was something far more insidious. You were not willing to accept your husband's powerlessness over his own fate, the way he had been reduced to nothing more than a puppet at the mercy of the blackmailer. You, too, had your
own reasons for wanting to end the charade."
Lady Ramsgate's lips tightened, her composure slipping just enough to show the briefest hint of something, perhaps regret or guilt, before she regained her usual stiff reserve. "It is true," I said slowly, "that you knew of the affair. But it was not that knowledge alone that led you to seek your husband's demise. No, it was your desperate desire to take back control of the situation, to free yourself from the grip of the man you had married, and to secure your place in the family.
Once and for all.
Your resentment toward your husband had festered for years, and his death, though a tragedy, was also an opportunity." She opened her mouth to speak, but her words faltered. The room was silent once again, and in that moment I could see her face
Crumble ever so slightly, just enough for me to know that I had struck at the very heart of her true motive.
"But it was not you, Lady Ramsgate," I said, taking a step back, "who carried out the murder." There was a collective breath held, as if everyone in the room had simultaneously realized where I was going with this. "Do you know who did?" I asked, quietly, my eyes now locking on to the person who had so far remained largely unexamined. Lily, the quiet, seemingly inconspicuous daughter of Lord Ramsgate. Lily's head jerked upward, her wide eyes locking onto mine, and I could see the briefest flicker of panic. She had been sitting in her chair as if she had already resigned herself to the inevitable, but now, in that one moment, I saw her true. Emotions break through the veil of indifference. "Lily," I said gently, "you have been the one hiding the deepest secret of all." Her hands trembled in her lap, and her voice, when it finally came, was barely a whisper. "I didn't want to do it," she said, her words breaking the silence like the crack of thunder. "But he was going to ruin everything. He was going to leave me nothing. Nothing but the shame of his betrayal and the ruin of our family. I had to stop him before it was too late." Lily's confession fell into the room like a stone sinking into a quiet lake, sending ripples of shock through the others. Her eyes met her mother's, and I could see the raw pain and fear in them. Lady Ramsgate, despite her own guilt, now stared at her daughter with a mixture of horror and disbelief. "You see," Lily continued, her voice quivering, "I had always
been in love with Charles, but he never looked at me. He wanted my mother, and I couldn't let him marry her.
I needed to protect our family, to protect everything I'd ever known. But it wasn't just the inheritance, it was more than that. It was the shame of it all, the way my father had lived his life, deceiving us both. I couldn't bear it any longer. And when I found out about the blackmail, I knew what I had to do." The room was silent for a moment as the full weight of her words settled in. The other family members were stunned, unable to speak, as Lily's confession hung between
us like a heavy fog.
I could see the weight of her guilt pressing down on her, her body trembling with the enormity of what she had done. Poirot's final thoughts echoed in my mind. "Justice, mon ami, is served, but it always comes at a cost." I watched the Ramsgate family, each member shattered by the revelation, and I understood that justice had indeed been done, but it had come at a terrible price. The loss of a family, the unraveling of everything they had once held dear. And perhaps in the end, that was the greatest tragedy of all. Chapter 15, The Grand Denouement. The drawing-room was once again filled with a heavy silence. It had been several hours since Lily's confession, and the family members sat in their usual places, still shaken by the weight of the truth. Even Lady Ramsgate, who had been so poised throughout the investigation, appeared broken, her face pale and drawn as she looked at her daughter. The rest of the family, Charles, Farrington, and the servants seemed to have resigned themselves to the inevitable. The revelation had stripped away the last vestiges of their pretensions, and now they waited for the final act in this grim drama to unfold. I took my place at the center of the room, feeling the tension in the air like a palpable thing. Hastings, ever the dutiful companion, stood beside me, watching the scene unfold with a quiet, knowing expression. The time had come for the truth to be fully revealed. "As you know, mes amis," I began, my voice calm yet firm, "we have arrived at the conclusion of this most unfortunate case, and now it is time for the final piece of the puzzle to fall into place." I let my gaze sweep across the gathered faces, ensuring that every eye was on me. "Lady Ramsgate," I said, addressing her first, "you are not, as I suspected, the murderer. But your role in this tragedy is undeniable. You, too, were a victim, trapped in a marriage that had long since turned into a bitter sham. You uncovered your husband's infidelities and his involvement in the blackmailing scheme, and you harbored deep resentment toward him. Yet, it was not the affair itself that drove you to murder. It was your own personal feelings of betrayal, a desire to free yourself from the shackles of a man who had made you feel powerless." Lady Ramsgate gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, but she said nothing. Her eyes remained fixed on the floor, lost in thought. "And then there is Lily," I continued, turning my attention to the young woman who had confessed to the crime. "Lily, it was you who carried out the murder, but your motivations were not entirely as you had portrayed them." Lily raised her head, her expression one of deep shame and regret. Her confession had come with a kind of finality, a moment when she had understood the irreversible nature of her actions. But as I spoke now, I could see her shifting uncomfortably in her seat. It was clear that there was more to the story than she had let on. "I told you that I did it to protect our family," she said, her voice quivering. "To stop father from ruining everything, but there was more. I wanted revenge too, for the way he had treated me all my life, for the way he had chosen my mother over me. I had always been in his shadow, and I couldn't stand it any longer." I nodded slowly, acknowledging the depth of her pain. "Yes, that is true. Your motives were driven by a deep sense of hurt and anger. But what you did not reveal," I said, raising a hand to emphasize the point, "was that your actions were also influenced by something far more dangerous. Your belief that you could control the outcome, that you could escape the consequences of your crime. You thought you had eliminated the threat completely, that the blackmail would go away, and that you could reclaim your place in this family. But, as I have shown, the mind of a criminal is not so easily deceived." Lily's face crumpled, and she buried her head in her hands. The weight of her actions seemed to have finally come crashing down on her, and the tears she had long suppressed now spilled freely. The room was heavy with the sorrow of it all. One young woman, consumed by her own misguided attempt to protect her world, only to find that in doing so she had destroyed it. "But the true tragedy," I continued, "lies in the fact that you were not acting alone. It is easy to believe that the murderer is a lone figure, driven by their own desires and impulses. But crime, my dear friends, is rarely so simple." I paused, allowing the gravity of my words to sink in. Then I turned my gaze to Charles, the eldest son of Lord Ramsgate. He had been silent throughout the proceedings, his face unreadable. Yet there was something in the way he shifted uncomfortably that told me he too had been hiding something crucial. "Charles," I said, addressing him directly, You have a great deal to answer for. For many days I could not understand the full extent of your involvement in this matter, but now I see the truth." Charles raised his head sharply, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. "What are you suggesting, Poirot?" he asked, his voice tight. "Ah, you see, mon ami," I said softly, "it is not just the actions of a single person that lead to murder. It is the accumulation of lies, secrets, and deceptions that create the perfect storm. You, Charles, had the means and the motive to kill
"Your father." At this, Charles stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "That's absurd," he spat. "I love my father. He was everything to me." "Love?" I repeated, raising an eyebrow.
Tell me, Charles, why did you leave your father's side the night of the murder? Why was it you who found the body? Why did you allow the servants to believe you were with your father when you were not?" Charles froze, his eyes widening in sudden realization. He was caught in the lie that had haunted him. Slowly he sat back down, his face paling as the truth hit him like a blow. "Charles," I said gently, "you were not merely a grieving son, but a man desperate to secure his future. Your father had been unwell for some time, yes, but there was more to it than that. You feared that his death would leave you with nothing, that the inheritance would pass to someone else. Your entire future, your very position in life, depended on your father's demise, and so you acted. But," Charles began, his voice trembling.
I never meant for things to go so far."
I shook my head, my voice resolute. "You cannot undo what has been done, mon ami. You were the one who made the final arrangements, the one who ensured that your father's death would look like an unfortunate accident. You were the one who set everything into motion." The room fell silent once more as the full weight of the crime began to settle on Charles. He could no longer deny the truth, no longer run from the consequences of his actions. His world, which had once seemed so secure, was now crumbling beneath him. I took a step forward, looking at all those gathered in the room, each of them broken in their own way, each of them complicit in a larger tragedy. "A crime is a puzzle, mon ami," I said softly, my voice tinged with finality. "And with the little grey cells, all things are revealed." The pieces had all fallen into place, and justice, however imperfect, had been served. But as I stood there, watching the family collapse under the weight of their own sins, I could not help but reflect on the nature of crime and punishment. In the end, it was never about who had the most motive or the greatest opportunity. It was about the human heart and the frailty of those who lived within it. Justice had been done, but it had come at a terrible cost.